Perfect. Thank you very much, Rui, and thanks to Carla and the team for such a warm welcome. It's a real privilege to be here. So I'm going to start by striking a note of optimism. So I think that the first thing I want to say before I get to the rather more pessimistic material is that if judged comparatively, i.e. globally and in comparison with previous media forms, social media have always been liberation media, and they still are. And there's just a few examples on the slide there. But of course, we are living through something of a crisis, and I use that word deliberately. I don't use it lightly. I think that there's a lot to be said for the argument that we are in a rather unique constellation of different factors that converge to create a crisis of public communication. And I think that in communication and media, but not just that field, but also across the social sciences, we're still responding to the surprises of 2016, whether it's Brexit, whether it's the election of Donald Trump in the United States, whether it's the rise of populist, exclusionary movements in Eastern Europe or in Italy. I think we're still coming to terms with this, and this is my contribution to some thinking about one of the problems, which I'm calling the problem of indeterminacy, and I'll explain what I mean by that as I go through. I've also got lots of other conceptual things and material to introduce, but then I'm in the second half of what I'm going to say today. I've got some empirical findings from some recent research that I and my colleagues at the Online Civic Culture Centre in Loughborough have conducted, including some very, very new research on the issue of deepfake video, which is coming out next week, I think, in Social Media and Society. So I'm going to give you quite a blast of theory, but then I'm going to present some empirical findings, so hopefully there's something for everybody here. So I think one of the questions I'd like to start with is, to what extent is what I'm calling a culture of indeterminacy becoming embedded online? And I think this boils down to three different elements. First of all, a culture that's animated by an inadvertent or a willful disregard for the truth in public discourse. Does it involve threatening important liberal democratic principles? The ones that I would say are most important are authenticity, rationality, tolerance, trust, the recognition and integration of political differences in everyday life. And thirdly, is something that I think we ought to pay attention to, especially if we look at the role of elite actors in either journalism or politics. To what extent is this a strategic political project that will end up systematically favouring some actors over others? We've just gone through a big election in the UK in December, the Brexit election. It was characterised by levels of lying among politicians that I've never witnessed in my lifetime. It's almost like a willful disregard for the facts in public debate. So is there something broad going on here, and to what extent are social media implicated in that? That's my problem that I'd like to address. So I think that this is a problem of news and journalism, it's a problem of politics, but it's also a problem of online civic culture. What do I mean by online civic culture? Well, this is a sort of one-sentence definition that I've crafted that's based upon some of the material I've written in the last couple of years, kind of boiled it down for this talk. So it's the cultural expectations, norms of behaviour, and social, economic, and technological incentive structures that shape and are shaped by how people behave online. So online civic culture, and remember that the internet and digital media are not new any longer in political life or any form of life. They are, as mass forms of communication, they now are coming into almost their third decade. So I think it's important to stress that online civic culture is constantly evolving. There'll be key transition periods during which there are decisive breaks with the past, and when changes in online civic culture become embedded in ways that reconfigure aspects of liberal democracy. So I'd say that the online civic cultures of liberal democracies around the world are arguably going through that kind of transition right now. So one challenge for social science is how to develop independent, evidence-based analyses of this shift and its most significant features and likely long-term consequences. Now, the study of civic culture, it's interesting, from a Portuguese perspective, given, the 20th century history of Portugal. The study of civic culture has a long history, of course. This is Almond and Verber. They were political scientists. They published this book in 1963. It's one of the most influential texts in political science, going back 50, 60 years. And it's interesting because if we take their cue, they were quite controversial at the time because they moved away from the study of institutions and organizations and toward political attitudes and political culture as an important variable in whether or not democracies succeed or fail and how fragile they are and whether or not they're in it for the long run. So I was inspired by going back to this, I first read this as an undergraduate in 1990, I think. They have this really nice turn of phrase where they say that culture, civic culture, is about the ways in which political elites make decisions, their norms and attitudes, but it's also about the norms and attitudes of the ordinary citizen, his relation to government and his fellow citizens. It was written in 1963, of course, hence the male version. These are subtler cultural components, they argue. They have the more diffuse properties of belief systems or of codes of personal relations. Those are the kinds of things I'm interested in. I'm interested in the role of ordinary social media users in sustaining or eroding a healthy online civic culture. We can't study them on their own. We need to look at where messages come from. We need to look at the role of elites. But I think it's time that we turned away from a focus just on institutional embeddedness of online engagement and started to look at the longer term cultural shifts among ordinary citizens in liberal democracies. Now, this is difficult in a way because my research field, which is about digital media and democracy, or digital media and politics broadly defined, it's a huge area, it's interdisciplinary. There is a problem because I think that there are about 4 or 5 problems with research in this field over the last 20 years. I hasten to add that I've contributed to many of these problems with my own research. And I think it hasn't prepared us particularly well for the moment that we're living through now. And if you're interested, I published a paper published by the Online Civic Culture Centre in December, which you can download for free and read. It's a theory piece. I mean, I think and I won't go into too much detail on this because I want to move on, but I think the first problem with studies of digital media and democracy, and particularly social media, if we think back to the moment of the Arab Spring, I think its high point, 2010-11, that moment of great optimism, there's been a tendency to select case studies that are progressive or pro-liberal democratic and just focus on those. There's also been a tendency to ignore the goals of online engagement because there's been a celebration of engagement in itself. Those of you who are familiar with newsrooms as journalists will understand this when editors are shouting at reporters saying, we need more engagement on your stories because it's good for the advertisers, it's good for the paper. Well, it tends to ignore the goals, and some of those goals we're finding now are, of course, democratically dysfunctional. They're nationalist, they're misogynist, they're racist, they're fueled by religious hatred. So that's an issue. And another problem is that often this research has underestimated the tension or the trade-offs between emotion, affect, and all of the things that brings to politics. The ability to mobilize very quickly on the basis of emotionally resonant messaging, which we know that social media are really great for, particularly short-form social media like Twitter. But on the other hand, what you lose is the emphasis on deliberation, on reason, on hearing the other side. So what you gain in terms of quick-fire mobilization based on emotional messaging, going from, Zeynep Tufekci says, going from 0 to 100 miles an hour in movement terms in the matter of a few days. You also lose the ability to hear the other side, to deliberate and to think and pause. And I think that's a problem that's been underestimated. There's also been a tendency to focus on institutional and organizational forms as well. I think that's an issue, rather than the formation of public opinion, which is something that social media scholars have been a bit shy about drawing conclusions about. And then finally, and I think this relates most strongly to what I'm going to say in the rest of the talk, there's been an emphasis on rationality in public discourse. And this is in tension with what, of course, with what I said about emotion just now. But for many scholars, there's been an emphasis on rationality, and there's been an ignorance, really, or an underplaying of the importance of indeterminacy in digital culture. And that indeterminacy takes lots of different forms, about which I'll say something shortly. But the good news is that things are changing, and very quickly. So over the last 2 or 3 years, and things are really coming to a head of steam now, you know that this is the case when, for instance, the 2 main journals in my field, Political Communication and the International Journal of Press Politics, I'd say that of the last 6 months, probably about 1/3 to 1/2 of the papers that have been published, the new papers coming through, deal with this agenda in some way. So we've got new frameworks, and they're being recalibrated, really, for assessing these dysfunctional outcomes. I think we're learning also that elite persuasion and elite access to media of all kinds, of course including social media platforms via paid advertising, micro-targeting, that remains highly important for the formation of public opinion in ways that we perhaps underestimated when we were getting carried away by formulations such as crowdsourcing or the wisdom of crowds or user-generated content. All of that exists, of course, but elite action is also still important. Because disinformation and misinformation, hate speech, intolerance of all kinds are now radically networked in ways that they weren't before. And there's been an outpouring of new research focusing, as I say here, just on a few ideas: propaganda, which has made a big comeback, fakes, influence, bots, trolls, hatred, money, power. Not a particularly optimistic research agenda, but perhaps a more realistic one for the times that we find ourselves in. But a key problem, I think, in the work that's emerging is that there's this problem of how do we infer influence? And of course, as communication and media scholars, we're very acutely aware of this issue. How do we draw conclusions about how media shape our behavior? And it's bedeviled the field in lots of ways. Because to demonstrate influence requires analysis of the responses and the behaviors of individuals and collectivities as audiences. And a great deal of the work that's been describing, for instance, networks of influence on the alt-right on YouTube, just to take just one example, can't really say much about how individuals are responding to exposure. It's great for describing, and I think a lot of the heavily data-driven approaches to social media are great for describing the general patterns, but it's very difficult to then infer that people are shaped in some way and start to behave differently, and I think that's a big challenge for us going forward. But I think that we've got 3 things that are going on in this current constellation of new research. Many of the research products at the moment are generated by younger scholars. It's about producing better understandings of how social media interact with and potentially reconfigure the constraints on rational opinion formation at the individual level. It's about the conditions under which those constraints most strongly apply and the extent to which they're shaped by strategic power, cognitive biases at the individual level, social identities, and of course, social media affordances. The way the platforms themselves are designed plays a big role in this. And finally, and I think this is a big change, I think, from what we've seen in previous eras, and I think it makes it an incredibly exciting time to be a social scientist studying these things. It's about intervening, whether we're scholars, journalists, advocacy professionals, campaigners, or just ordinary citizens, to minimize the impact of these problems, to promote liberal democratic norms of tolerance and trust. And I think that's where we are. So the culture of indeterminacy is really just one strand of this bigger developing agenda. And I'd like to focus on that now. So I'm going to start with an Oxford English Dictionary definition of indeterminacy. I sometimes think it's useful to just go back and look at the etymology of a particular word. Of course, I recognize that I've got 2 struggles here. One is that indeterminacy is not in itself, ironically, a term with a fixed meaning. It's got a long history going back through the celebration of indeterminacy in postmodernist theory in the social sciences in the 80s and 90s, for instance. And of course, there is a language barrier. My Portuguese is non-existent. I certainly am not able to say the word indeterminacy in Portuguese. But I'll try my best to explain some of the tensions and difficulties with this word, but also some of the opportunities. So first of all, we've got the idea that something isn't fixed or established, it's uncertain, and uncertainty is a big theme in the research that we've been doing at O3C over the last 18 months. More on that later. Secondly, not settled or decided, left doubtful. People are in a position of some doubt about things. But then the third one I think is equally fascinating, not determined by motives regarded as external forces. So there's a sense of you don't know what the origins of things are, how do things come to be. And then finally, acting freely. And I think the acting freely part is particularly interesting because it raises the question of who then acts with freedom. And what I would say is that a culture of indeterminacy is more likely to enable those with authoritarian tendencies who seek to command and control to act with more freedom because the underlying culture in which politics operates is characterized by so much uncertainty that people withdraw into the private sphere and say, politics is not for me. And that, I'll come to that later on in a bit more detail, but that was the lesson really of the neo-Stalinist states in Eastern Europe. If you read the writings of Václav Havel and other dissidents, for instance in Czechoslovakia, as was in the 1970s, that was their big criticism. It's not that people were duped into believing propaganda, it's that they withdrew into the private sphere because they thought, I can't get involved, there's so many lies in public life that it's just not for me and I will retreat into the private sphere. And I think that's bad for citizenship, it's bad for the idea of civil society. So what are we looking for? Well, culture, as Raymond Williams famously taught us, is built upon lived experience and behaviors. It's not something that we absorb from on high. So what kinds of experiences and behaviors might we be looking for? Well, we now have a political communication environment in which people are much freer to engage in three interconnected types of action that are reshaping online civic culture in negative ways. First of all, we've got behavior that deliberately spreads false or misleading information to promote ignorance, misunderstanding, conflict, division, and intolerance, or to simply succeed in routine political settings. So I think it's a mistake to see this kind of thing as just being at the margins. The second is action that for various reasons, results in the inadvertent spread of false or misleading information. So it's people who are sharing information, they're not quite sure of the origins of it. Some of them will be acting deliberately, but many, and I'll show you some data on this shortly, are acting inadvertently. They don't realize, or at least they're only half aware. And then there's behavior that aims to foster broader cynicism and detachment by undermining trust in the public sphere. And I think if we look at some of the movements in Eastern Europe or in Italy in particular, you can see elements of this. And finally, something that I'd just like to add is I think that contrary to where the debate's gone, if you follow this area over the last 2 or 3 years, the importance of automation and bots, I think we're now at the stage where we're almost reaching the limits of that kind of analysis because we're recognizing that humans, real people, with all of their frailties, are also part of the problem. And usually in concert with automated forms of activity. So just one example, you look at the Internet Research Agency, the Russian disinformation agency, in its role in the 2016 US campaign. If you look at the evidence that the social media companies put before Congress last year, so the Instagram posts that were posted by the Internet Research Agency, the IRA, during 2016 were liked on Instagram by ordinary Americans 185 million times. So we've got a mass phenomenon in which ordinary humans are acting in concert, either knowingly or unknowingly, with automated forms of inauthenticity online. So what are the sort of broader ingredients for this culture of indeterminacy? And this is where I start to draw on recent work from other scholars to kind of present a picture. My own work has looked at hybridity in the media system, the interrelationships and interdependencies between older and newer media forms. I did a second edition of the book, The Hybrid Media System, that came out in 2017, where I wrote a new chapter, a rather long chapter, looking at the 2016 US campaign. And the term I came up with is dysfunctional hybridity or democratically dysfunctional hybridity, the kinds of things I'm talking about in this talk today. We've also seen the multiplication of information flows in the media system, the fragmentation of audiences, very familiar themes. Silvio Weisbord, the journalism scholar, calls these problems of counter-epistemic communities. What he means by that is that there's much more willingness now to attack the views of experts and to have a very partial and partisan version of the truth that's good for mobilization, but might actually not be related to the facts as they stand. We've got Thorsten Quant's idea of dark participation. So what that literature draws attention to is the idea that people's goals when they participate in online engagement, they can't be assumed to be pro-civic or pro-liberal democratic. In fact, we now know that there are many examples of online engagement, whether it's the far right or it's misogynists, whose goal is to undermine the values of liberal democracy. This can be taken further in the ideas of Wanless and Burke, their notion of participatory propaganda, which is a sort of the strongest version of this argument, really, which is that people will wittingly participate in the spread of falsehoods in order to further a political cause. We've got Phillips and Milner and their idea of the ambivalent internet, where they focus on trolling as a social practice online. Again, this goes back a long way, but it's got new urgency now. It's an important part, I think, of the culture of indeterminacy, this desire to destroy, to rip up, to sort of a nihilistic response to the world, which says that we just want to destabilize elite politics and elite journalism, and that's what we're going to do. Computational propaganda, my old friend and colleague Phil Howard, with their project at the Oxford Internet Institute. And we've also got something that's been ignored until very recently, which is that fakery and deception is now much more sophisticated than it used to be. So we've got the problem of deepfake video as just one example. I'll say a bit about that shortly. And then we've got the strategic hijacking of online nodes as well. So we've got a division of labor online. There's been a lot of emphasis on social media platforms, but there are also user-generated sites, for instance, like Urban Dictionary, which are absolutely awash with all kinds of hate speech and made-up definitions that suit political purposes. And yet they feature very highly in Google search rankings, and there is evidence that they are hijacked by online movements, particularly the alt-right, particularly online misogynists, such as the incels. And then we've got audience responses. So if you look at a great paper that came out in the Journal of Communication by Toff and Nielsen in 2018. They did some really great qualitative, in-depth work in the north of England, looking at people's responses to news on social media, and they found that I don't know what to believe is emerging as a pretty common response among people when you ask them how do they go about finding news. And then we've got social psychologists such as Michael Bang-Peterson and his argument about chaos motivations, as they're known, the need for chaos among Western publics. They did surveys in Denmark, in the United States, and they found that the desire to watch the world burn, as they described it, was present among roughly 20 to 40% of the Danish and American public. A very controversial piece of research. We've got general decline in trust, which we are familiar with in media organizations. Recent Reuters Institute reports, going back at least 5 years, demonstrate this. So it's this argument, as I said just now, that a healthy skepticism in the public realm turns to cynicism and therefore withdrawal. And it's this argument that there's a distinction between skeptical approaches, which we would encourage to public information, but then there's cynicism, which goes a step further. What are the likely responses? The likely response is to say, that's not for me, they're all in it for themselves. And of course, that in itself fuels the populist impulse. It frees illiberal elites, and of course non-elites, everyday campaigners, to willfully mislead because so little can be trusted. It's kind of a liar's license or a liar's charter. If nothing can be trusted, why not just lie? Everybody else is doing it. But also, on the other side of the coin, it potentially frees illiberal elites to campaign on promises to restore order and certainty, to deal with the chaos, and in the process, curtail liberal democratic rights. So either way, I would say that liberal democracy loses from this situation. And of course, these arguments and ideas are not new. They go back a long way. They don't really go back to studies of propaganda in the immediate post-war period, which were largely focused on the experiences of the 20s and 30s in the Second World War. But they do relate back to revisionist accounts of propaganda, such as those of Hannah Arendt and others, who argued that the problem of propaganda is not so much that people are directly misled, because achieving that is really difficult, but it's that there's a general culture of uncertainty that leads people to lose the capacity to think and judge. And this famous quotation from Hannah Arendt from 1978 summarizes this issue quite nicely, I would say. So this is a problem of elite communication, but also a problem of mass public self-communication. And as I move toward talking about some of the findings of recent studies that we've done, I just want to give you an idea about how me, my colleague Christian Vakari, my colleague Ben O'Loughlin, have gone about trying to study the role of ordinary social media users in this culture. So I've got quite a lot of text on these slides. When I'm speaking in a foreign country, I always tend to put more text on the slides because I think it's probably easiest, because it's hard for you to focus on me speaking at the same time as... So it's easier to digest the written word, and of course I can send you these slides by email as PDF if you'd like them after the talk. Here are some assumptions. I've got a couple of slides here about the kind of ontology we're bringing to this, which is a sort of fancy way of saying here are some assumptions that we make about how the world works and how we generate our research based on them. So first of all, we start from the view that there's an interdependent relationship among social media platforms, news organizations, and social media users. And Jane Singer's work on shared gatekeeping is interesting in this regard, some of my previous work too. People use news to construct narratives to make sense of public events. We know that from research on the active audience for news. An example here is Elizabeth Bird's work from the 90s. But also what happens increasingly now in our media systems, of course, is that people are not passive recipients of information from the news environment. So we take the perspective that individuals enroll, is the word we use. They enroll. It's almost like they sort of gather it together and they use it as resources. They enroll it in the action. They use specific media resources to exercise agency in everyday social media settings. So this is about the affordances of social media, absolutely. The design, the algorithmically curated news feed being one of the most problematic elements, the commercial logics underlying platforms being problematic as well. It's about those affordances of untraceability of production and circulation, inauthenticity, which has become a huge problem for the platforms themselves. It's about cues from journalists. Not all journalists have a wonderfully pro-liberal democratic public mission. Many of them don't operate in that environment, and increasingly so. And it's also, particularly in the UK, where we have tabloid journalism. It's about cues from political elites. Think Donald Trump tweeting. It's about automated and algorithmic cues. Think about the ways in which news feeds present information to you and the opaque nature of that and how difficult it is to get some understanding of it because these are secrets. And it's about visuals and it's about text. Also, finally, in this point, if we look at the dialogical tradition in communication and media, so if we look at language and social interaction studies going back to Bakhtin, the great Russian linguist who was very influential in the 20th century in the study of linguistics, Bakhtin had a really fascinating argument that when you communicate something, it shapes your beliefs as well as the beliefs of the person you're communicating with. So the act of speaking or the act of sharing on social media shapes your consciousness because you're paying more attention to it and you're doing the act of expression with the receiver's views in mind, and that makes it more powerful. Think about having a conversation versus writing an email to somebody you don't know. Having a conversation with somebody is more likely to have an impact on your sense of self, I would argue. We can expand this view and say that when somebody shares on social media, that can shape their subsequent behavior and expectations about what it is you're supposed to do on social media. So this brings me to the idea of the share as the most important moment in our social media saturated world. The central importance of the social media share. But this raises all kinds of questions. Why do people share? What are their motivations and goals? How prevalent are motivations that are ambivalent or negative for online civic culture, such as deception or trolling? Sharing is about spreading information, but it's also about signaling behavioral norms to others. So when you share something, you share a piece of information, but you also, by sharing it, and also with the dialectical relationship between your decision to share and the information itself, you're signaling a behavioral norm to others. You're saying to others, I think this is worth sharing. So there's a strong social endorsement cue involved in that. But what happens when large numbers of people give visibility to ideas that are founded on values that seek to undermine liberal democracy? Does it give license to others to then join the club, as it were, because they feel like they're part of something? So one of the interesting things is that whenever there is reportage of racist incidents online in the news, we see an uptick in the rise of street-level racist incidents. So whether it's anti-Semitic, anti-Muslim, you name it, there is a correspondence. Now, it's very difficult to demonstrate directly empirically, but I think it's the same kind of thing that's going on here. It's about signaling behavioral norms that are problematic. There's also the mobile nature of news now as well. Affective real-time interventions. So, the idea of an instantaneous emotional response to a news story. And we know if we look at the work of Zizi Papakarisi and others, that emotions are really strong in driving engagement on social media. But of course, this has its downsides. And there's little research that focuses on people, their motivations and their behavior. There's a lot of research that focuses on automation, but less on people. And finally, much of this increasingly is visual, of course. It's mimetic, it's Instagram, it's increasingly video-driven as well, which makes it even harder to research. So this leads to the sort of media as resources ontology that I first presented in an article that came out in New Media and Society that I wrote with Christian Vakari and Ben O'Loughlin about the role of tabloids in influencing misinformation sharing on UK social media. I'll talk about that shortly. So the media as resources ontology, okay, it's circular because at heart I'm not a dyed-in-the-wool media effects researcher who assumes that individuals are sort of tabula rasa that are affected by outside messages. We have agency, but also we've got to recognize that what we read and watch and what we share enters our consciousness and plays a role in reshaping our political attitudes and social attitudes. So this is a focus on the share as being at the heart of the problem of the spread of misinformation online. And that's the diagram. Now, so that's a kind of blast of theory. I now want to talk you through some evidence from recent O3C research. A health warning at the start of this. This is just a small fragment of the bigger cosmos of research that is going on around the world in this area. These are just our small contributions. And they're mostly UK focused as well. So what I'll be saying here is empirically mostly about the UK. So bear that in mind. So I want to talk about 4 particular pieces of work that you can download for free. You can download 3 of them for free, actually. The other one, you can download the draft version from 2018, but New Media and Society control the copyright on that one. The other 3 are freely available because Social Media and Society is actually open access journal, which is really good. I'm going to start by talking about this piece of research, which is where I and my colleagues started on this journey of trying to come to grips with a UK-specific version of the problem of misinformation on social media, which tried to get away from some of the cliches that had developed very quickly out of the American context. So for this study, we did a survey of Twitter users who shared links to news articles during the 2017 UK general election campaign. And we had a data set of those survey respondents' tweets also, about 1.5 million of them that they shared during the campaign. So we did a content analysis of the links that the survey respondents shared, divided those up into 6 categories of news, and then correlated those with their survey responses where they self-reported about 2 types of behaviors that we call misinformation and disinformation. I'll show you some charts later on in a couple of minutes which show you the questions. But with this one, because it's an older piece of research, I'd like to just share the findings with you. The beauty of this research is that I think it was the first time that a survey could be married with the actual behavioral data of social media users. In other words, we didn't rely on what they told us they'd shared in terms of news sources. We could actually see what they'd shared. And it was conducted ethically and according to the usual ethical standards of research. So it was all anonymized. But what we found were some really quite troubling findings that speak to the importance of news or media as resources in this problem of misinformation. First of all, the tabloid news media have what we called an elective affinity, drawing on Max Weber's ideas of a sort of loose relationship, an interdependent relationship between 2 social forces, with democratically dysfunctional news sharing behaviors. The more that users shared tabloid news on social media, and I hope I don't have to tell you about, the story of tabloid media and how important they are in UK politics, and also how they don't adhere to many of the standard professional norms of reporting that many European countries enjoy in their press systems. So the more that users shared tabloid news on social media, the more likely they were to share news that was either exaggerated or made up. In contrast, we found no evidence that sharing news from other sources, non-tabloid sources, predicted this, what we call democratically dysfunctional news sharing. And this included broadcast news, international news, online native news, the likes of BuzzFeed, Huffington Post, quality newspapers. It was tabloids that did the work. Thirdly, motivations really matter. Those who were motivated, and who told us they were motivated in the survey to entertain or to troll other users, were more likely to engage in misinformation and disinformation when they shared news. Those who were motivated by desires like seeking to persuade or inform others were less likely to share problematic information. And finally, probably the most pessimistic finding that we came up with is that challenges and corrections were pretty minimal. Those with the strongest motivations to behave in these dysfunctional ways, such as entertaining or trolling, and those who shared more tabloid news weren't more likely to be corrected by other social media users. So what we find is the idea that the wisdom of crowds, that self-correction as a mechanism, one of the big cliches of social media going back 15 years, doesn't really work in the UK context. So what we also did later on is go back to the whole survey and look at the survey results as something in their own right. And what we found was, and this was a different survey, I should add, a different piece of research that was co-funded by Opinion Research, who are an opinion poll company in the UK, and they gave their services for free, which was really great. And we've had a long-standing partnership with them as well. We did some surveys in the recent December election in the UK. They've been very generous to us. So we took some of those questions that we did in the earlier survey just of Twitter users, and we took them to a survey representative of the UK population. So it's a national opinion poll of the kind that you will often see during elections. So the sample was about 2,000 respondents. It was in late summer 2018. And we focused mainly in the analysis on UK social media users. We defined these people as people who use Facebook, WhatsApp, Twitter, and Instagram, which are the 4 most popular platforms in the UK. We designed a special questionnaire that assessed socio-demographic characteristics, political attitudes, motivations for news sharing, and behavioral patterns. And as I say, it was hosted by our data partner, Opinion Research. So I want to start by just talking a little bit about the different motivations for sharing news on social media. We asked some I should preface this by saying it's really hard to do survey research when you're asking people about behaviors that they might say are socially problematic. You know, we're all familiar with the problem of social desirability bias in survey responses. People want to appear to be good people. So you've got to be really careful in the way that you phrase your questions. And I'll come shortly to the questions about misinformation and disinformation. You can't just start asking people, do you seek to deceive others? You can't really say that because you know what the response is going to be. But there are certain tricks that you can include in question ordering and gently moving people towards responses that I think are a good, and if you read our methodological appendices for these articles, you'll realize how much we agonize over these things. But it's important to bear in mind that you can't just go straight in and say, are you a bad person? Because after all, that's not really what we're asking anyway. We're asking about behaviors. It's not about a judgment about the moral character of an individual. Because a lot of this, I would argue, doesn't come down to that, but that's another story. So if you look at motivations, we had this list of motivations that we thought were a nice mix, but they revealed things about people's attitudes to sharing that we thought were quite interesting. So first of all, it's pretty obvious that a good chunk of UK social media users sees social media as an opportunity to influence others. And, you know, I think it's about time we probably recognize this fact that people behave instrumentally on social media. And it's not just the small minority of political activists, it's a lot of people. So if we look at these motivations, so there's three I just want to focus on. First of all, to entertain others. Secondly, to feel like I belong to a group. Thirdly, at the bottom there, and again, you know, this is where you're getting close to asking people questions that they're not likely to respond to, wholly truthfully, I would argue, to upset others. So these are kind of emotional responses that tap in a way, or emotional actions that tap into something that goes beyond the rational citizen model of politics. The rational citizen model of politics, although bear in mind to express my feelings is right at the top there, which we thought was interesting, but it's kind of neutral. The rational citizen model is about informing, finding out other people's opinions, provoking discussions, but the emotional model is these kinds of things. Now, there's a question of how you interpret these findings. I won't dwell on this for too long because I want to move on, but to entertain others, is that a civic motivation? Well, yes, absolutely it is, but it also has relatively uncivic elements to it as well. To feel like I belong to a group, one of the problems of social media, it's become a cliche almost, is the problem of echo chambers. The evidence is disputed in that regard, absolutely. There's evidence on one side, evidence on the other. But feeling like I belong to a group, you can see how that would tie into that argument about the insularity of echo chambers online. And then finally, upsetting others. Now again, to upset others, if you're a political activist, you might want to upset others to jolt them into action. In a crowded information space, emotionality and upset is an important resource, but also it has a relatively, or it's civically ambivalent because it could exclude as much as it includes. It could switch people off and people could think, that's not for me, or you've gone too far. And so it can have an exclusionary or divisive element to it, and I think we need to be alive to that. So there's some civically ambivalent motivations there. What about encountering problematic content? So we asked this question, sometimes people might post articles on social media that aren't fully accurate. In the past month, how often did you come across news on social media that you thought was not fully accurate? And we found that about 58% of UK social media users said that they saw inaccurate news on social media in the past month. Quite a high percentage. But what about sharing problematic news content? So we asked this question. Some people might share news on social media that turns out not to be fully accurate or exaggerated. In the past month, do you recall sharing a news story that? And we have these four categories. Now, we first used these questions in that tabloids paper, Twitter survey in 2018 that we ran during the 2017 general election. We took those questions and modified them and added to them from the Pew Research Project in Washington, D.C. They'd run a survey in 2016, just after the election, where they'd crafted these questions that were beautifully done because they give people a bit of as we say in the UK, leeway. They give people a bit of flexibility in how they want to respond when they're asked about potentially damaging behaviours. So the questions were, you thought was made up when you shared it. We categorise that as disinformation. It is the willful sharing of false information. Was exaggerated and you were not aware of this? Well, slightly different. I wasn't aware of it. Seemed accurate at the time, but you later found was made up. Again, it opens up that possibility of people finding out later on, so it's a less problematic act. And was exaggerated and you were aware of this. Again, disinformation, but it's exaggeration, not stuff that people were aware that it was made up. So if you look at this, what we found, and we had to check these figures more than once because we were astonished to see this level, that about 43% of UK news sharers on social media shared problematic news. And if you look at the category of people who said, we thought it was made up when we shared it, it's the highest category, 17.3%. Okay, you could say it's a minority. Of course it is. But it's a pretty substantial minority. And remember, this is across the UK news sharing public on social media. This is not just a snapshot of a platform such as Instagram or Twitter. This is a general survey. So we were quite astonished by this. So we thought, well, maybe people will be corrected by others for sharing problematic news. But what we found in this regard is results that were similar to what we found with our tabloid paper, is that correction is a minimal or flawed mechanism. So we asked people whether they were told by anyone on social media that the news they shared wasn't fully accurate or exaggerated. So 66.2% of people said, we didn't come across that, it didn't happen. I do not recall that any of these happened to me. That's the bar at the bottom. Now you could argue that the glass is half full, as it were, and you've still got something left to drink, because 33.8% of UK news sharers were corrected by others. But given the prevalence of problematic information sharing going on, we would have expected that to have been higher. Some of my American colleagues have pointed to that finding and have said, oh, it's great, look how many people are being corrected. But there's an imbalance between the extent of sharing of problematic information and the extent to which people are corrected. And we think that that's where the problem lies. Because you can see it here as well in my final slide from this study. We asked people, we turned the tables and we asked people, did they correct others? So we first asked, were you corrected? But then we asked, did you correct others? And we found that about 79% of UK social media users did not correct others. Okay? So 11% did, great. But the majority, the vast majority, did not. Now, correcting others on social media, and many of you will maybe be on social media, Twitter, Facebook, it's a socially demanding form of activity. It's risky. In academic life, for instance, somebody posts, something on Twitter, will another academic say, no, that's wrong? I mean, there are all kinds of power relations going on there, okay? But at the same time, given the prevalence of the sharing of problematic information, we would expect the levels of correction, if the mythology of the wisdom of crowds works, to be much higher. So we think that that's problematic. We don't think that the wisdom of crowds really works in the way that the platforms themselves would like to think it does, particularly Facebook. So finally, I want to say, before I talk just in the very last moments about some ways forward, I want to tell you about just a third piece of research, which is hot off the press. It's supposed to be out already, in fact, but should be out, as I say, with a fair wind next week. And this is about the issue of so-called deepfake video. Now, I'm not going to get into the weeds of what deepfakes are, and I'm not going to sort of talk about all of the speculation and hype around them, because I don't think that's the interesting thing about deepfakes. But I'll show you this picture. This is Emma Gonzalez. She was one of the survivors of the 2018 Parkland, Florida mass shooting, school shooting. So in this deepfake video from that year, gun lobby campaigners in the United States, pro-gun rights, spliced in the US Constitution to replace the shooting target she was tearing up. She did a photo shoot and a story with Vogue, Teen Vogue, actually, magazine. Tells you a lot about journalism now. Teen Vogue covered the Parkland, Florida shooting, probably better than any other news outlet. So Gonzalez did this photo shoot, and she was tearing up a target to demonstrate, I'm against gun rights, but gun rights campaigners turned this into an animated GIF, and it went viral. It was her tearing up the US Constitution. You may remember this video BuzzFeed ran in 2018, where they had Barack Obama speaking, saying outrageous things, and it looked incredibly realistic. It was voiced by the actor Jordan Peele, and it was only toward the end of the video that you realized that it was Jordan Peele. Any of you familiar with this video? Kind of went viral globally. So we saw this video, my colleague Christian and I, and we had this idea that, what's interesting about it is the educational reveal, as we called it at the end, where they say, oh, it's not really Obama. I can tell you, I was fooled. When I saw it for the first time, I thought it was Obama, okay? I was absolutely certain until the very end when Jordan Peele came on and the split screen emerged. So we thought, let's play around with some concepts from social psychology and its understandings of why people believe misinformation. So we had ideas of fluency, the idea that if you become familiar with a person's bodily movements or what they're saying in the video or piece of information, you're more likely to believe it because you're familiar with it, irrespective of whether it's true. And that is experimentally proven, by the way. So we had a slightly long version before the reveal. We had a very short version, which just had Obama calling Donald Trump a dipshit. You remember that? That was the line in the video that was the most bizarre. And then we had the full-length version. And we ran a national survey, again with Opinion Research, where we designed the survey with lots of questions related to media use and trust, but we embedded this survey experiment at the end of the video, 3 cuts of the Obama-Peele BuzzFeed deepfake. We filtered out anybody who'd already seen it, so they didn't take the experiment. Have you seen this video? Their results are thrown out, although interestingly in peer review afterward, we were told to put those back in for statistical reasons that I can bore you with in the Q&A if you want. But there's a fierce debate going on right now about the validity of experiments based on data that you remove or when you run post-experimental correlations. So we ended up putting those 100-odd people back in. But we had a big survey, 2,000 people, and we divided them randomly, pure random assignment, and we checked afterwards to make sure that the demographics were similar in each of the 3 groups. So we assigned the 3 groups each of the different videos and did a comparison across the videos, and we had pre-test measures of trust in news on social media. That was our most important variable. We wanted to understand whether or not exposure to deepfakes reduced people's trust in news in social media. And we wanted to understand whether or not being deceived by the video had a relationship, or becoming uncertain about the video had a relationship with trust in news on social media. Because underlying this is this Hannah Arendt model that indeterminacy undermines trust, leads to cynicism and withdrawal. I don't know what to believe. So the findings were really, really quite startling. So in our experiment, the deceptive deepfakes, the ones that didn't show the reveal, did not directly deceive respondents in a statistically significant way. They did deceive respondents, but when we ran the numbers across the 3 categories, there was no statistical significance between the 3 groups. Really surprising finding. So what was going on? Well, uncertainty. Deceptive deepfakes elicited significant amounts of uncertainty in the don't know responses. So significantly more participants who watched one of the deceptive videos expressed uncertainty about the truthfulness of the videos. And then what happened is that participants who expressed uncertainty about the video in the post-test question had significantly lower levels of trust in news on social media after controlling for their pre-exposure levels of trust that they told us about in the survey before they were exposed to the video. So the conclusion that we draw from this is that we think that deceptive deepfakes will deceive people. In fact, there is some small-scale experimental research that's been done by computer scientists where they show that 50% of the time people are deceived. So in other words, they get it right 50% of the time, but as statisticians in the audience will know, that's not really very good because it's a coin toss, effectively. We think that that's the case, but in our experiments, probably it's an artifact of the way that we did the edits and we were expecting too much. We found that it was uncertainty that was more likely to be the outcome. And therefore, it's uncertainty about the information environment that's probably the bigger picture here, rather than, as I said earlier, direct deception via propaganda. Just say a couple of things about why deepfake videos are so troubling. And a lot of this is not in the paper because we took it out for reasons of brevity, but it's there in that 03C paper about the crisis of public communication that I authored and published in December. So first of all, there is a problem. There are two levels of this problem. And I'd be really interested to hear your perspective as communication and media scholars about what's going on here. First of all, there's the share. So we know that images and videos are more likely to be shared on social media than text. We've got Bernhard Rieder in the audience here, who's a supreme expert on analysis of social media data, and we'll be able to say that that is the case. I hope so anyway. Sorry, Bernhard, for putting words into your mouth. But that's one problem. Secondly, there's the cognitive directness, as social psychologists tell us, the so-called picture superiority effect, or the realism heuristic. Shyam Sundar, communication psychologist, has taught us about this. Pictures do something to our minds that is more direct than text. They have an emotional impact on us. We're more likely to remember them as well. We all know this as humans, but it's been demonstrated in labs. And thirdly, fluency. Familiarity through exposure to visuals can elicit fluency, and fluency leads to credulity. In other words, the belief in something, even if the truthfulness of the content is not that great. And studies of this go back to the Second World War that examine the diffusion of rumors in societies. Simple repetition of something is a statistically significant predictor of whether people will believe it. The more times you've heard something, even if it's false, you're more likely to believe it. We're all frail humans, after all. But I think there's another level here of what's troubling about deepfake video, and it really goes to the heart of one of the problems of communication and media research. Because deepfake video is different from previous forms of disinformation because of its level of realism and because of the way that deepfake videos are manufactured technologically from publicly available resources. So when Stalin was airbrushing photographs in the 1930s to remove Trotsky from photographs because he didn't like him anymore, which is an understatement, but there you go. You know, there were people in the Soviet system who could see that they'd been airbrushed. And if you look closely, reproduction technology was, of course, much poorer, newspapers and so on, and symbols weren't in wide circulation like they are today. This is different because to manufacture a deepfake video involves learning in an AI scripted way using deep learning techniques that are coded from existing photographs and video of real people. Okay? So this challenges quite a lot of conventional wisdom about how active audiences decode biased information. You know, we go back to the great theories of Stuart Hall in the 1970s and 80s about the active audience, about how we interrogate texts, about how we're not duped. These have all become commonplace, but deepfakes really challenge that. Also, deepfakes challenge it because they're non-fictional. So we all learn over time. There's some great work in the field of cinema history that shows what happens when audiences are exposed to special effects for the first time. Going back to the early days of cinema when, you know, the Lumiere brothers in Paris were showing trains arriving at the station and people thought they were coming out of the screen and ran out of the cinema because they were shocked. They'd never seen anything like it before. But of course we adapt very quickly. So if you go and watch a Spider-Man film, you've suspended your disbelief because you've got used to the special effects, and we adapt very quickly as viewers. But that's fiction. It's not non-fiction. So Is it possible for audiences to mobilize all of these resources to interrogate these things? The cognitive and informational resources, the reference points, the cultural reference points, the filters we use to make sense of problematic information in our daily lives. Is it as easy for us to do that when videos are so well crafted at the technological level? And I think that that's the deeper problem. And I think that is why the platforms themselves have acted on deepfakes very quickly. So last week, Twitter announced that it was banning all deepfake video that was politically motivated during campaigns. Facebook has issued a similar statement, though not as blanket as or wide-ranging as Twitter's. And I know from speaking with people inside the platforms informally that they are seriously concerned about deepfake video because of the way it will challenge the idea of authenticity online. I just want to close with a couple of slides about some things we don't know and some ways forward, and then I'd be really interested to hear your questions. So, the first thing I'd like to say is that we know very little that's qualitative and longitudinal about the uses and functions of misinformation in local contexts, everyday contexts. We know hardly anything. So it would be great to have more research that focuses perhaps on small-scale local communities, in-depth, over-time analysis of individuals. And I also think it's important to focus on private messaging as well, which has become hugely important, particularly WhatsApp, but also the privacy affordances of Facebook, for instance, Facebook Messenger, and of course Snapchat that has privacy built in most of its affordances. So private communication as well as public platforms. Another question that is really sort of fascinating to me is we can see that there's declining trust in social media platforms and media organizations, but is that accompanied by declining interpersonal trust among people on social media? So it's very difficult because there's very few surveys of this, but can we sort of identify a point in time when people were much more trusting of each other on social media, and has there been a downward slope? I genuinely don't know the answer to that. How can we identify the conditions under which influence occurs and when it doesn't, which I think is a key problem for the entire field? Can we come to grips with problems like deception and gullibility? These are awkward problems for communication research. Other fields don't seem to be as squeamish as communication. So if you look at psychology, you look at management, business studies, there's actually literature on fraud and the behaviors that lead to fraud, and it's pretty scary because it has a lot to do with interaction in the moment and also the actions of the deceiver. So if you look at the literature on con artists and fraud, the individual who does the fraud, their actions can make a lot of difference. And lots of people are susceptible. It's not just those who have low knowledge of the news, low knowledge of public events are less educated. We're all susceptible because the interaction takes place in the moment. Also, can we understand digital literacies in the plural? Can we look at a different range of relational interactions that occur between people? Psychological mechanisms, socio-cultural mechanisms, technological, spatial, geographical, temporal factors. As people navigate the chaos of the contemporary media environment, can we get inside those moments a bit more richly than we have done previously? Because I think digital literacies in the plural will always differ. One person's digital literacy in terms of understanding politics and public events at the highest level, following parliamentary coverage, for instance. Most people, most of the time, are not politically active in that sense, but they require information in their everyday lives to make sense of their lives on financial matters, health matters, for instance, about which there has been a great deal of controversy, particularly in relation to health, when it comes to misinformation. Think the anti-vaccine movement globally, for instance. So can we understand these things in a more relational and local context? How then can we use this knowledge to inform smaller scale local community initiatives to tackle misinformation? Rather than expecting all of our research to have a huge influence on the platforms at the meta level, which, as we know, it has got mixed results so far, partly because there's lots of pushback from the platforms themselves. Can we instead go to local community levels and start talking to people in their communities? Can we support journalists and fact checkers? Absolutely, but also diversify. How might research inform alternative models, such as Bellingcat with its open source Intel approach to gathering information, or even, dare I say, Wikipedia, probably one of the true survivors of that moment of real optimism in the mid-2000s. For all of its problems, it survived, and it does a decent job. It's an interesting model. It's also a highly used model as well by ordinary internet users. And also non-profit platform models as well, which again have withered over the last 10 years. But can we revive that idea of a platform where the commercial logics are not more likely to produce affordances that are more likely to lead to dysfunctional behaviors? Can we explore the interconnections between different online aggregation nodes as well? Rather than just looking at Facebook or just looking at Twitter, why not look at the whole mess? Platforms, search engines, public and private messaging, forums, local, national and international flows. Bring those things together and look at the division of labor, because they are being hijacked by, for instance, misogynists. I mean, if you look at, there's some great work came out in New Media and Society a few months ago by Debbie Ging, who is at Dublin City University, where she looked at how misogynist movements online had hijacked the meanings and put definitions and meanings into Urban Dictionary, the online site. And of course, Google, usually if you do a search on some sort of slang term, Urban Dictionary would be there in the top 10 or 20 results. It has a huge monthly user base. So it's that kind of interconnection between different parts of the online space that I think we need to pay a bit more attention to. And finally, a couple of just practical points. How do we walk the line between raising awareness and becoming part of the problem of amplifying misinformation and hatred? Because that is a real problem. There is a school of thought now, for instance, if you look at the work that's coming out of Data and Society in New York, scholars such as Rebecca Lewis, who's still a PhD student, she's doing some really interesting work. You know, there's a big controversy here over when we write and spread the word about our research about these groups and organizations, we are giving them the oxygen of publicity. So how do we walk that line between just sort of pointing to stuff in a sort of non-reflexive way where we automatically retweet hatred and say, look, this is awful. But in doing so, we're spreading the word. And we know that simply spreading the word exposes more people to the information. So we've got to be careful what we do. So I would say the way through that is to just spread the word about your research and not spread the word about the objects of your research that you find every day on social media. But I'm not sure if that's an easy path to take. And finally, methodological pluralism. We were talking a bit about this last night in the restaurant. It was really interesting. Let's not be distracted by the divisions of a bygone era between quantitative versus qualitative work, or media effects versus the active audience, or the sociology of news production versus audience research. Let's not get sidetracked by those debates, because if we want to understand, and I think most communication and media scholars do want to understand this, how communication and media can have power and influence in the world for good and ill, then we need to have some understanding of how they shape behaviors. And I don't think it's acceptable anymore to just say, oh, that's a bygone era debate. You know, we've proved that media have limited or minimal effects on people. I don't think that applies in the same way in the era of social media. So I'll end it there. Thanks very much for listening. I hope you found that interesting. I look forward to your questions. Thanks a lot. Thank you.